This screencast will cover the lower respiratory system. In this screencast, we'll be covering the following objectives: describe the anatomy of the trachea, explain the functions of the trachea, and describe the primary bronchi. The trachea connects the larynx with the bronchi. The larynx, again, is where your voice box is located and is the opening to the trachea. The trachea then extends into the thoracic cavity where it divides into a left and right primary or main bronchus. The trachea is also known as the windpipe. The walls of the trachea are composed of various layers of tissue. The inner lining or mucosa is composed of pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells, and they also contain goblet cells. So goblet cells produce the mucus. The mucus captures debris, dust, bacteria, various substances that are in the air that's inhaled. It gets trapped in the mucus that lines the mucosa of the trachea, and then the cilia of the pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells then beat back and forth and move that cilia with all of the little nasties that we would prefer not to get to the lungs, moves it back to the larynx, and where it can be coughed up or swallowed. In people who smoke, often I believe it's the nicotine from the smoke, destroys those pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. They're replaced by stratified squamous epithelial cells, which do not have the cilia, and that will tend to cause the accumulation of mucus in the lungs, because the ciliated cells that would mobilize that mucus and move it out of the lungs, up the trachea, and out of the respiratory tract are absent. That is why some smokers have that real deep smoker's cough due to the mucus collecting in their lower respiratory tract. Now, the good news is, once you stop smoking, the pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue is regenerated. Deep to the mucosa is the submucosa. The submucosa has glands. Those glands produce mucus, and they also produce an enzyme called lysozyme that breaks down the walls of bacteria. So it's an antibacterial substance. If you recall, in the digestive system, there was also lysozyme in the saliva produced by the salivary glands for the same reason, to destroy bacteria. The outermost layer of the trachea is composed of C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage, and I say C-shaped in that they are on the lateral sides of the trachea and the anterior side of the trachea. So they look like pretty much the shape of a C. Hyaline cartilage is somewhat rigid, and that's good because it prevents the trachea from collapsing. And then you have between those C-shaped rings of cartilage adventitia, which allows some flexibility in the trachea, allows it to bend somewhat. On the posterior side of the trachea, we don't have hyaline cartilage. Instead, we have the trachealis muscle, and I'll explain the significance of that in a moment. I want to go back to the hyaline cartilage, those C-shaped rings at the adventitia between them for a moment. If you really think about the structure of the outer portion of the wall of the trachea with those C-shaped rings with adventitia between them. They sort of remind you, or they remind me anyway, of a vacuum cleaner hose. With a vacuum cleaner hose, of course, you want something that is not going to collapse in on itself. And at the same time, you want it to be flexible. So with a vacuum cleaner hose, you have these rings, which are rigid and prevent it from collapsing. And then between those rings, you have the flexible plastic, which allows the vacuum cleaner hose to bend. In a similar manner, that's what you have with the trachea. You have the cartilaginous C-shaped rings, which prevent it from collapsing. If the trachea were to collapse, that would prevent air from moving in and out of the lungs. And at the same time, you don't want it to be a solid tube. You want your trachea to be able to for it to be somewhat flexible. And so you have that adventitia, that soft tissue between those C-shaped rings. And if we looked at an actual trachea, it would look something like this. You'd see the rings, cartilaginous rings, and then you see the adventitia between those rings. Let's go back and discuss the presence of that trachealis muscle on the posterior side of the trachea. Why not have cartilage on the posterior side as well as the anterior and lateral sides? Well, it's because on the posterior side of the trachea, sharing a wall, if you will, is the esophagus. And the esophagus is a muscular tube that is responsible for moving a bolus from the pharynx to the stomach. We don't want cartilage there because it would interfere with peristalsis. Looking at this sagittal view of the head and neck, you can see the trachea is that tube on the anterior side, and directly posterior to it is the esophagus. So that's why we have muscle, soft tissue, on the posterior wall of the trachea rather than cartilage. The function of the trachea is to connect the larynx with the bronchi. So we have this branching off the trachea into the right and left primary bronchi, which then enter the lungs. Now here's a situation where the human body is not completely symmetrical on the right and left side. Notice that the right lung is larger than the left lung. Therefore, the right bronchus is shorter, but it's also wider than the left bronchus. And because it's shorter and wider, if you do happen to aspirate food into the trachea, it's more likely to enter the right bronchus and lung than it is the left bronchus. We have now arrived at the lungs. So for our final learning objectives, we will cover the following. We're going to describe the location of the lungs, describe the pleura of the lungs, describe the respiratory tree, and differentiate between bronchi and bronchioles. The primary bronchi enter the lungs at these depressions, which are called hilli or hilus. The lungs occupy the majority of the volume of the thoracic cavity. The apex of the lungs are located right below the clavicles, and the base of the lungs rests on the diaphragm. The lung is divided into 3 lobes by fissures, or these grooves. The right lung, as I mentioned earlier, is bigger than the left lung, and it contains 3 lobes, the superior, middle, and inferior lobe, while the left lung has a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. Before moving on, I have a question. Why would you think the right lung is larger than the left lung? Do you have an idea? If you said it's because the heart is left of center and takes up more space on the left side of the thoracic cavity more than the right side, then you are correct. Surrounding the lungs and composing a portion of the walls of the lungs are the pleural membranes. Now, the pleural membranes are serous membranes. Recall that serous membranes line the entire anterior or ventral body cavity, and they have two layers. They have different names depending on where they're found. The serous membranes that surround the heart are called pericardial membranes. The ones that surround the digestive tract or digestive system are referred to as peritoneal membranes, and these same type of epithelial membranes when surrounding the lungs are referred to as pleural membranes. And we have two, as is common for serous membranes. The outer is the parietal pleura, and it's shown here in sort of the dark blue, and that's what's actually lining the thoracic cavity. And then attached to the lung itself are the visceral pleura. Then between those two, you have a potential space which is filled with fluid called the pleural cavity. So this is very similar to what we saw in the peritoneal cavity with the digestive system and the pericardial cavity with respect to the heart. This is an image I stole off the internet showing, pretty much the same thing. Shown in sort of the light blue would be the parietal pleura, and then shown in the sort of like the magenta, I guess is what that is, would be the visceral pleura, and then you have between the two the pleural cavity. And this visceral and parietal pleura, like the visceral and parietal pericardia, slide past one another very easily, but are not pulled apart very easily at all. Have you ever heard of the respiratory or bronchial tree? It collectively refers to all the bronchi and the structure that they form as they branch from the trachea. So the trachea branches into the two primary bronchi into secondary bronchi, and the secondary bronchi to tertiary bronchi, and finally leading to bronchioles. Collectively, it resembles an upside down tree, and that's what that term respiratory tree or bronchial tree refers to. As we talk about the respiratory tree, I want to be sure that we clarify a couple of terms. So above that red line there are bronchi. Singular would be bronchus. So primary, secondary, tertiary bronchus. These are macroscopic structures. In other words, they're big enough that you can see them with the naked eye. They are mainly composed of cartilage, and smooth muscle is a minor component. This means they are less likely to collapse. Below that red line are the bronchioles. Bronchioles are microscopic structures. You cannot see them with the naked eye, only with some type of magnifying device. In contrast to the bronchi, they contain less cartilage and more smooth muscles. They are more likely to be impacted by inflammation or some kind of condition that encourages collapsing of the respiratory passages. Diseases or conditions like emphysema or asthma have a much greater impact on the size of the bronchioles than they do the bronchi. Before ending, let's review the learning objectives from the screencast. Describe the anatomy of the trachea, explain the function of the trachea, describe the primary bronchi. On Wednesday, I will start lecturing on the respiratory system, starting with slide number 40. Thank you and have a great day. Bye.